Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time. Today, I'd like to talk to you about one of the greatest ways you can change the world, the virtue. I'm going to go over the impacts of virtue, how the concept of virtue originated in Western thought, and why there are challenges with virtue in society. Then I'll show you some solutions as well as the research behind it. The reason why virtue can be so impactful is because it has ripple effects. Generosity is generative. So by acting generously, uplifting someone, you present to them an opportunity to learn virtuous engagement. An example of this can include when people crowdsource to positively solve a community challenge, like neighbors coming together to repair a sidewalk that in turn benefits the community. Sometimes a full community could fundraise an individual to pursue higher education. There's also awareness-based social campaigns on social media that highlight the positive causes, which can in turn reverberate through these network effects and cause positive changes all around the world. You can find virtue in everyday acts as well as habitual acts like good parenting. Think about when someone says, man, this young person was so well raised. What does that mean about the young individual? And what does that say about the parent who raised them? The concept of ethics from the Western philosophy originates within the works of Aristotle. Early institutions known as Neoplatonic schools instilled in their pupils or students both intellectual virtues and moral ones. They're engaging in Socratic dialogue and discussion. Now, intellectual virtues are more conceptual, like wisdom, understanding, and science. Moral virtues pertain to upstanding qualities like generosity, friendliness, and courage. The intellectual ones generally lean towards what our current academic system is instilling. Aristotle describes a concept of the golden mean. The idea is that virtue can be found as an average or a mean between two extremities. So for example, let's take the concept of courage. It's not quite on the picture of this tree here, but imagine that it was written in gold somewhere on this tree. And just like the other terminologies here, there are two branches on each side. So imagine you cut off the excesses, the extra branches on the left and right side, and you turn them into logs, and you place the logs on this balance scale over here in this illustration. And essentially the idea in this thought experiment would be that the extremity of courage in one direction would be cowardice. And in the other direction, it would be something like recklessness. So to think about it in that regard, you can think that looking at courage, courage is beyond being cowardly. It is beyond cowardice. However, it doesn't reach up to the point of being reckless. So courage is kind of in between. It is a mean or an average in between these two excessive qualities. And that in turn enables it to have a virtuous quality. My interpretation of wisdom, which is an intellectual virtue, is something beyond philosophical understanding, but it's not constrained to the rational sciences. Another point of note, when I mentioned Socratic dialogue earlier, just to make sure that was explained, it's generally a way in which people engage generally within a circle in order to exchange and obtain information. Oftentimes, there is a bit more of an open setting to the classroom and approach. And generally, during the times of Aristotle, it wasn't just that the virtues of sciences and understanding were being taught, but also moral virtues on what it meant to be an upstanding individual. A critical challenge that our modern society faces is that it prioritizes the rational over the philosophical understanding of moral virtues. So from a Western education perspective, most courses are assessed and tested by proficiency in subject matter. So for example, in a course on math, English, history, and science, the outcome is generally related to the assessments in context to the subject. But there's no habituation, no positive reinforcement for virtuous behaviors that are ingrained and instilled within this system. There's no rite of passage either that enables the obtaining of virtue. And through that understanding of virtue, philosophical understanding, that of the understanding of purpose and passion, which could help the majority of young adults that are entering adulthood to know what they want to do with their lives. As a result, it's entirely possible for someone to matriculate through school, potentially through even a higher education, and not acquire any virtuous disposition or know what they want to do with their lives. I had spent 8 months overseas living in Senegal as part of a program known as Global Citizen Year. Now it's currently called Tilting Futures. The objective was to achieve this rite of passage that was missing, in which I could obtain virtuous understanding, and my understanding of what I wanted to do, and my direction towards it could be better analyzed. And what was really amazing about it was that there's virtues that I learned while working in a tailor shop or supporting my community or for my host family, that was outside of the structure of traditional education. They had this lesson about what's called duck syndrome during this program. And the idea was that imagine, as a thought experiment, that a lot of a classroom where there's students that appear happy and they appear content and joke around with each other on the surface level, but on the bottom level, beneath the surface, there are some serious challenges that are occurring. And it is similar to this illustration here where the ducks seem happy and chirpy. However, underneath they have to paddle extremely heavily, and they also need to avoid being sucked in by the weeds and continue jumping through all these different hoops to stay on the surface. So even though it appears like the pond is calm at the top, beneath the surface, they're constantly paddling to try to keep up with with each other. And that is sort of an interpretation of one of the challenges that we can find within our system. However, fortunately for our society, virtue does not need to necessarily depend on a classroom structure in order for it to be exhibited in society. So in other words, if you may have had a few inspirational professors or teachers that did help support you and support your vision from a virtuous perspective or from a perspective of what your purpose was going to be, that the entire society as a population isn't going to be entirely dependent just on having access to a type of professor that will take the extra time to support a student, that rather society at large can create virtue through other means. There are two solutions that I would like to speak with you about. The first is something that I've learned through the writings of Aristotle, and the second is from my personal journey. Aristotle identifies friendship as one of the greatest ways to obtain virtue. He dedicates two very large chapters in his book about this. But because he really understands virtues as qualities that need to be instilled through positive reinforcement or habitually, he understands that friendships can be an experiential way of obtaining these virtues positively. Overarchingly, there's three types of friendship. The first is known as friends of pleasure, but generally I will refer to them as friends of recreation. The reason is the pleasure is what is brought about by the friendship in terms of immediate gratification, but the recreation is more of the act of what the friendship involves. So in other words, the friendship in of itself, this type of friendship that Aristotle identifies, is recreational. It's based off of someone, it might be someone you jump in the pool with, have fun with, watch movies with, go party with, play video games with. There is a fluid anchoring of the friendship that aligns with fun and having fun and engaging in recreational activities. The second type is that of utility. Now, utility is more anchored in the sense that there is a governance in it based off of the means of exchange. So these are oftentimes friendships that you might find in the professional world. And also, if they could be your co-founder, if you're trying to establish an enterprise, they could be study buddies, or they could be people that you engage with and exchange with. So, for example, if you are very good at English and history, and your friend is very good at math and science, and you take him or her or that individual on as a study buddy, in turn, you would be able to provide some subject matter expertise, and they would be able to provide the other, and there is an exchange that occurs. However, after you complete your education and both of you pursue different vocations, it may be entirely likely that you both may not be keeping in touch or continuing that friendship in that current state, because the basis of this friendship was the means of exchange in terms of information. Now, there's also exchanges that are of goods and services. So imagine you go to a salon or to a barber. In the case of a barber, you get your haircut and you have a good time with the barber. Maybe you catch up on sports or the local news. And first and foremost, the prominent thing that is to be accomplished is that your hair is being cut properly. And given that as a variable, you can have a positive and enjoyable experience. But the relationship is based off of a means of exchange primarily. So if you move into another town or into another city, chances are you will need to seek out another barber or go to another salon. This friendship is actually very interesting because it's dependent off of those means of exchange. It is subjective to the ways in which our society is changing in how we exchange, i.e. through technology. So, for example, the artificial intelligence is actually altering a lot of these friendships. For example, maybe you no longer need a study buddy if you have an AI tool that can help prepare and help you study for a course that you may not be as proficient in, then maybe you no longer need that utility anymore. As of today, there isn't any artificial intelligence that's properly cutting people's hairs, so you might be safe on the salon and haircut side, but it is a evolving friendship. As technology evolves, so does this friendship. Another point of note I'd like to bring up about is don't just think about these friendships from a philosophical perspective, of course. And of course, do think about it in terms of the applicability of where different people may play in roles in terms of your everyday life. But also consider the social media factor of this, right? These social media companies are not entirely unaware of these forms of friendship, even though they may not be in the current education system generally, where most people will go through education without learning about the types of friends there are. That does not necessarily mean there's a complete unawareness of this by social media. Let me give you an example. Friends of pleasure, or as I refer to it, recreation. What types of social media platforms generally promote this idea of liking a post and applauding something that's been done, and looking at the fun and engaging activities that a friend is engaging in, right? What is this attracting? What forms of friendship does this attract, and does it allow for you to maintain on that platform? Similarly, what type of social media engages in professional networking? Isn't there any professional networking social medias that allow you to connect with different individuals and follow them, or be able to reach out to them and to build your professional profile, etc., right? So these are happening within our various society, even through the transformation of our technology. The final form of friendship that Aristotle identifies is the friendship of virtue. Now, this is considered the highest form of friendship by Aristotle. And generally, the idea is that there is, you find an inspirational quality in another individual. And that individual finds an inspirational quality in you. In turn, the friendship is not fluidly anchored off of fun, nor is it governed by certain responsibilities in of itself, but rather it's uplifted by the inspiration you have in each other. So primarily, the friendship is based off of that uplifting of virtue. And that in turn means that you both are able to gain virtuous knowledge and qualities through this friendship. And because this friendship is virtuous, it contains the other elements of these subjective forms of friendship that are required in our exchanges in society. So in other words, a friend of virtue can also be a study buddy, and they also can jump in the pool with you and have fun. So a friendship of virtue can be recreational, and it can offer utility. It's just that the basis of the friendship isn't that of the exchange of what someone has to offer you, nor is it the fact that they're funny or that they're able to bring you joy and fun in the immediacy of the friendship, but rather it's because there's an inspirational quality in that individual that sustains the nature of the friendship, or rather uplifts it. So this is important to note. If you look at the friends of utility, a lot of times they are generally ones where you might see a lot of co-founders operate. And generally that's because co-founders are co-governing an enterprise. So sometimes there's terms where you hear people say, oh, don't start a company with your friend, right? Well, what that really is referring to, because remember, friendship is not a widely taught subject. Most people are not taught about friendship in a traditional sense. So generally what that's actually referring to when that's said is the friendship of recreation. And the idea at large is that a friend that is mainly based off of having fun with, where you might be going to party with them or have fun with them, swim with them, watch movies, that there isn't the same level of responsibility within this friendship that is required in that of utility. And the idea is that there is an exchange between co-founders in which they are agreeing to co-govern an enterprise. And as such, a friendship where that responsibility may not be needed may not carry over into a friendship of utility and its requirements. That said, friendships can grow. So you could start off meeting someone and having a recreational friendship that could then grow into that of utility. Now, in turn, to be very clear on this, there are some challenges with the two in terms of utility and pleasure, in that they can wither or disappear over time. And they also can be subjected to other things. So utility sometimes can be subjective to politics, for example, in the workplace. That can affect your relationship with professional colleagues because sometimes the means of exchange don't always provide equivalent satisfaction. So for example, if a barber starts cutting your hair incorrectly and not the way that you like it, that can lead to potentially a less satisfactory relationship that you might have with that other individual. If that makes sense. But overarchingly, the good news about virtue and this idea that you could have friends of virtue, teachers even that might be able to empower you or enlighten you with virtue, is that you can instill virtue and infuse it into other exchanges of friendship. It's not likely at this day and time that all of the people that you're going to meet are going to be your friends of virtue. We live in a society where we do still engage and exchange and also meet different people for different reasons and learn different lessons. And as such, there are other forms of friendship that will occur. But that doesn't mean that we can't infuse virtue in those experiences, provided that the nature of the utility is done properly. You can have a great experience with your barber and connect with him and give him some advice, or maybe he could, or that individual, the barber, could give you some advice. And likewise with this form of friendship as well. So if you can instill virtue into the nature subtly, um, into these other forms of friendship, you in turn can inspire them and give them insight to engage in virtuous behavior down the road. It's important to note that being virtuous also implies being responsible. So if you're so nice in giving with your time to the extent that you're not able to govern your own self, you may need to evaluate that. On the other hand, if someone is taking advantage of you, being complacent is not a responsible response because it's not fair to your own well-being, right? Your own well-being is also virtuous. Remember when we had talked about that Aristotelian golden mean, that idea of the being the average or the mean between two excesses. And I used two logs, not like mathematical logarithms, but like thought experiment logs. For example, with recklessness and with cowardliness or cowardice for in context to being courageous. Similarly, there is a balancing act to be achieved with generosity. Generosity balances being kind with also being responsible. And also, of course, it's virtuous to be generous to yourself as well. As you make mistakes and you learn along the way in your life, it is also a virtuous quality to remember that with your own self. Now, of course, these variables can intersect sometimes, but friendship can pose a solution to being able to understand these virtues better. So a piece of research here that I'd like to share. I'll link all the different research reports that I have benefited from, and I hope can benefit you in the description. But this one was a study that was conducted on the levels of collaboration within groups. And essentially the idea was that by using uncooked spaghetti and a marshmallow and some tape, the idea was to try to get groups to build the tallest freestanding, as in it's not taped or someone's not holding it, but it can stand on its own. So the tallest freestanding tower. Whichever group was be able to do that would in turn win within a certain period of time, as this was a timed exercise. And there was all sorts of groups being timed by this. There were doctors and lawyers and engineers and scientists and all sorts of people. And they found something extremely interesting. What they found was that the majority of adults really struggled with this. And generally that had to do a lot with the arguing over who was in charge and the challenges with as it was being constructed, it being done with a very singular focus, which I'll get into a little bit later. And one of the outliers, of course, were engineers, which is fortunate for all of our society that engineers can build structures, as we do rely off of them for our infrastructure. However, there was a subset, there was a specific group that was able to create taller freestanding towers than the majority of the adult samples that were tested, and those were kindergartners. So yes, kindergartners were capable of creating better towers using the same materials than adults were, primarily because they collaborated. Now, researchers were curious and they wanted to learn more about what kindergartners were doing. And they found out that kindergartners were also curious in that they, instead of building a structure from the ground up, the same way most people may be habituated in their understanding of how to build a tower, they in turn would actually just hold the marshmallow at the very top of the tower and then build underneath it a tower and see how well the tower would be able to stand. And every time the tower was not able to, they would do it and try again iteratively with different prototypes until they had a freestanding tower. So they had multiple test runs before they even hit the time limit, whereas the general average adult population, after figuring out who was in charge and who needed to do this and who needed to do that, would spend the majority of time building one type of tower with a singular focus, and generally within the last 30 to 45 seconds put the marshmallow on top and hope that it stands on its own. So overall, that curiosity supported kindergartners, but there's also qualities of their collaboration in the sense that kindergartners generally were more collaborative. And from that, those qualities had stemmed from the natures of the classroom. Kindergarten is one of the outer parameters of our education system where the virtues on average for the majority of the population are still being rewarded as part of the curriculum, in that a kindergartner, when they're cleaning the goldfish or opening the door for people at recess or writing the announcement on the board, or whatever their daily or weekly responsibilities might be, can be rewarded with a golden star and can be recognized for their virtue. And in addition for their being recognized for their virtue, they're also being recognized for responsibility. So in turn, they a social cohesion is built within the classroom that is beyond the just the subject matter of its own. So in turn, they were able to leverage that virtue to enact a larger level of capability from collaboration than adults were. The good news for adults is that the majority of them were actually in kindergarten. And even if they weren't, they were at least at the age of a kindergartner and had the open-mindedness and willingness and understanding of virtues implicitly. And that means if we could do it in kindergarten, then there's really no reason why we couldn't build such a tower as adults. Now, of course, this tower is just part of an experiment. It is just spaghetti and marshmallows and tape. But imagine the types of problems that we would be able to solve if we leverage the same virtues that our kindergartners would, in terms of the challenges in our society that we could be able to fix together through the collaboration, and the virtues also reinforcing those behaviors. So it's an interesting thought experiment. There's a great TED talk about it, which I'll link in the description as well. Adventure. Adventure allows the capability to see the world from a different perspective. That ability to see different perspective, known as a paradigm shift, is what allows for you to change the world. It's sort of this idea that you can't really solve a problem in the same mentality as the one that allowed it to exist in the first place. This hero's journey is archetypal. By that, I mean it portrays underlying traits of human nature that we've known about, at least implicitly, for a very long time. It wasn't just superheroes on TV that are overcoming the odds. There's also tales of mythical heroes on quests in almost every culture of the world. An adventure allows for an immersive self-discovery process. You hear phrases like travel is the greatest teacher, and they come from this idea. So as I mentioned, I had taken a gap year after high school in Senegal, and it was through an organization called Global Citizen Year, and now it's called Tilting Futures. And the idea at the time was that by spending 8 months abroad with a host family, through immersion, I could attain experiential learning that would allow for me to improve and reimagine the trajectory of my life. There was this concept then that was being taught known as the stretch zone. The idea was that self-discovery happens beyond the comfort zone, which would make sense, right? It's hard to learn something if one is comfortable. One needs to leave the comfort zone a little bit to be able to learn something. But at the same time, it doesn't surpass the danger zone where experiences on adventure could in turn become self-destructive. So in many ways, it felt like we had our own golden mean to uncover during our journey. This average between the two extremities of comfort zone and danger zone, finding that place where true discovery can happen. This program actually collaborated with researchers and concluded about how this process raised happiness, creative thinking, purpose, a higher level of purpose as well as obviously some language benefits. I'll link the report. They also have other forms of programs as well, so worth worth considering. This idea of friendship and adventure, they're just such virtuous opportunities. They both allow a journey of self-discovery in their own way. So while you're planting your own tree, governing your life, you can nourish yourself with these key qualities of virtue through friendship and adventure. And when someone asks you, or rather, when you start thinking about what it means to be virtuous, I endear that you find it as an opportunity. It's not that just by being virtuous that you are helping others or you're being nice to others. It's that you're giving them the opportunity to find virtue and direct their own lives for the better. So it's not the fact of being kind to be kind in of itself, but even beyond that, that being generous responsibly can in turn allow someone else's ability to generate virtue. By helping others better, you can in turn better the world. Don't be afraid to take the adventures, to make friends, learn from mistakes, and find some delights along the way. Thank you very much for your time.